Good evening, everybody. Welcome at the Italian Cultural Institute in New York. Some months ago, we hosted here at the Institute an exhibit, Disparate Crossing, of photo by Paolo Pellegrini. It's a very impressive reportage he did from the Mediterranean Sea about the migration, in which the migrants look not like a crowd, but like individuals. In the same days, more or less, Gianfranco Rosi won Golden Bear at Berlin Film Festival. And a few weeks after our exhibit and winning of Gianfranco Rosi, I went to the UN to see an event dedicated to Primo Levi. And in that occasion, I heard a beautiful speech by Masa Mengistu about Primo Levi and displaced people, not only during the Second World War. And a friend of mine, who is here today, said to me that Masa published a beautiful reportage, The Madonna of the Sea, on Granta about the situation in Lampedusa. And in that moment, I decided that it was important to understand why so many artists wanted to face the migration problem and how they did it, not with a political approach, obviously, but showing and telling what they see. This is the reason why we decide to do this conversation that we are going to have tonight. I'm sorry because we try to have also Paolo Pellegrini here, but he, like many photographers, he is around the world, I don't know where, and it's impossible to have him here. But we have Gianfranco Rosi and Masa Mengistu. Masa Mengistu is an Ethiopian-American writer. She was born in Addis Ababa and lived in Nigeria and Kenya before settling in the United States. Her debut novel, Beneath the Lion Gaze, was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books and named one of the best books of 2010 by Christian Science Monitor, Boston Globe, and other publications. Her fiction and non-fiction can be found in The New Yorker, Granta, The Guardian, The New York Times, BBC Radio, and Lettres Internationales, among other places. Both her fiction and non-fiction examine the individual lives at stake during migration, war, and exile, and consider the intersection of photography and violence. She was a writer on the social activist documentary film Girl Rising, which features the voices of actors such as Meryl Streep, Liam Neeson, and Cate Blanchett. She currently serves on the board of Words Without Borders and Warscapes. Her second novel, The Shadow King, is forthcoming. Gianfranco Rosi is an Italian director, cinematographer, producer, and screenwriter. Rosi was born in 1964 in Asmara, Eritrea, not so distant from Masa. During the Eritrean War of the Independence, at just 13 years old, he was carried to safety in Italy in a military plane. After living as a youth at Rome and in Istanbul, at 20, Rosi moved to New York City to attend the New York University Film School. He made his film debut with Boatman, which was screened at various international film festivals. His film Below Sea Level won the Orizzonti Doc Award at the 5th Venice International Film Festival. His film Sacro Gra won Golden Lion at Venice International Film Festival, and Sacro Gra is the first documentary film to win Golden Lion in history of the Venice Film Festival, and the first Italian film to win in 15 years. His 2016 film Fire at Sea, as I said before, won the Golden Bird at the Berlin International Film Festival this year. Rosi is the only documentary filmmaker to win 2 top prizes at major European film festival. Now I'm going to leave the floor to Andrea Visconti, a journalist of La Repubblica here in New York, who is the conductor of this conversation. But before, I want to quote, to explain better than with my words, what it means for me this evening. A quote from the beautiful and very positive review of the film of Rosi in the New York Times on Friday. Is by A.O. Scott, who wrote, Mr. Rosi takes a hard, empathetic look at reality, which contains wonders as well as horrors. It doesn't bear witness an overused and often presumptuous idea. He observes with humility and precision. Instead of raising awareness, it cultivates alertness. Fire at Sea occupies your consciousness like a nightmare, and yet, somehow, you don't want it to end. Before starting our discussion, I would like to show you the trailer of the film of Gianfranco Rosi. Enjoy.
Buona domenica ed eccoci anche oggi ritrovati al quotidiano spazio dedicato all'informazione.
Scassare! Fammi un po', che non me la viene dire!
Your position, please. Your position.
Please, can you help us
Okay.
quickly?
How many people?
150 persons. We have small children. Please, can you help us? We are staying here in...
Come on, guys.
C'è solo uno qua alla varicella che sarà l'ultimo ad imbarcare sulla treno 2.
D, C, E, Z, K.
Cosa ti senti?
Non riesco a far entrare l'aria un po',
Bravo,
capito?
bravo. È un problema solamente che sia un po' ansioso, che sia un po' in tensione. Tutto questo ti lascia tanta rabbia, ti lascia un vuoto nello stomaco, un buco.
Your position. My friend. Hello. Hello.
Good evening. I'm Andrea Visconti, and I will be moderating this evening, including all of you. If you have any questions, please don't wait until a Q&A. I think that we should just make it a broader conversation with our guests. I believe in 2015 there were over 65 million refugees in the world. Obviously, we're talking huge numbers of extreme importance. But to give you an idea of how amazing it is that we're here tonight, a few hours ago in Italy, in the area of Ferrara, there was a bus carrying refugees that was blocked by the local population. They built barricades to stop the bus from going in. And supposedly they said, well, we didn't realize that it was only women and children. We thought it was adult men. This sort of sets a stage, I think, for our conversation tonight. Since both of our guests have Lampedusa in common, perhaps we can start by asking you, how did you end up in Lampedusa, and what was your approach, and how you decided to tell the story that you saw in Lampedusa?
I was living in Rome at the time, and this was in 2011. Of course, the situation, the crisis was happening even then, and in Rome I was working in a center that was teaching Italian to newly arrived immigrants, and we were not only teaching them the language but also helping them through writing to begin to talk about what they had been through on the journey from their home into Italy. And there were people there from every country you can imagine that's in conflict right now. And I got to know some of them really well. But I also have a very, very good friend of mine named Dagmawi Yimir, who is from Ethiopia, and he also fled Ethiopia and was on that journey through the Sahara, through Libya, onto the boats, and ended up in Rome, where he is a director now. And I would talk to him and other friends of his and about their experience. And what I was realizing was that I don't know if Dagmawi is now a filmmaker. He makes documentaries, and he's involved with training other migrants, people who are coming over, to use the camera so they can begin to tell their own stories and document the stories of other people around them. And I was wondering, when I was listening to him, who would ever imagine, who from the West would ever imagine that someone who was on one of those boats would get off and live a life where he's behind the camera and editing films and writing films? How much do we actually imagine about a life after survival? And so I decided to go to Lampedusa to learn a little bit more about the whole situation, and also to see if I can talk to the Coast Guards, which I did, and if I could talk to the residents who lived there and try to find out from their perspective what's happening. Quite by chance, when I was there and I was speaking with one of the Coast Guards, he said, look, if you stay for a little while, there's a ship coming in 2 hours. There's a boat coming in. I said, how do you know? He said, we know everything that happens on the waters. They need our help. So if you stay here, you can follow us right to the front, and you can see what's happening. And so I went, and that's the article came from that.
We'll get back to the article
Yes.
in a moment.
Yeah.
The boat was a boat of migrant arriving.
Yes.
Mhm. Which is interesting. I just grabbed this moment from her exposition, and because in 2011 was completely different in Lampedusa, because people arrived straight in Lampedusa.
Mm-hmm.
There was no border in the middle of the sea. since 2013 with Operation Mare Nostrum and then Frontex and then Triton. It was issued this border in the middle of the sea. So now all the boats are intercepted or rescued, depends on the situation, in the middle of the sea. So now they don't arrive anymore straight in Lampedusa. So if I would have done my film 6 years ago, 5 years ago, I would have a completely different film than the one I did in the last 2 years, 3 years. Because when I arrived in Lampedusa, I found myself in a situation which was completely surreal for me.
Yeah.
There were no migrants there, and there were no contact whatsoever between the population of Lampedusa and the migrant. I was imagining in my mind always a little land where people were somehow interacting and exchanging life. And that was not the case, because most of the time now people arrive there in a way which is very institutionalized. They are brought in Lampedusa, they spend only 2-3 days there, and then they are sent in Italy in this hotspot center where another odyssey starts, and that's another film. Unfortunately, I could not cover that. But it's interesting to see how politics change constantly, also the point of view of the story we want to tell. And in my film, I was somehow obliged to tell the story of a separation. So Lampedusa in my film becomes like a macrocosm of what Europe somehow is, with two worlds that they never somehow interact. And I was lucky enough in my film to find this incredible man, Dr. Bartolo, who is somehow in between these two worlds and is able somehow to create this link of human passion and human awareness between these two worlds.
Perhaps for those people in the audience who are not familiar with the geography of Italy, you want to sort of give us a sense of Lampedusa.
By the way, I want also to say that Doug is a fantastic filmmaker. He's a
Yes.
friend of mine. He's an
wonderful.
incredible man. He's a great filmmaker, full of passion and full of want to learn. He's a beautiful man.
Yeah. Maybe Rosie can give as an
You want to give us sort of a sense of Lampedusa. We're talking about just give us a sense of where is this island? What do you find when you're there?
Well, the first things that happened to me when they asked me to go to Lampedusa, because I was asked to go to Lampedusa. That was a difference of my other film, which I encountered myself, the subject and somehow the necessity of making a film. This time I was asked, the idea came from Istituto Luce, especially from Carla Cattani, who is a person that somehow involved immediately with an incredible will, and he wanted me to make this film in Lampedusa. I knew about Lampedusa only through the media, through the newspapers, and I knew it was in Sicily, Lampedusa, I didn't know when. And I remember the first time I went to see on a map, Lampedusa was not even in the map. So it's beyond the access of a map, Lampedusa, because it's so close to Africa that there is no space to include Lampedusa within the border of Italy, which I never understood why they don't make a little square and say there is also Lampedusa.
Like Hawaii's.
Like a little red thing, you know, the Lampedusa exists somewhere. So it's really literally out of the map. And when I went there, for me it was incredibly surreal, the place. Plus, on that period there, the hotspot center was burned. So for 6 months, I didn't see a single migrant in Lampedusa, which in a way for me was interesting because I could focus more on the population. And this is what I wanted to do in my film, to somehow also, because Lampedusa was always told and narrated and through the press and through the TV, through the media, as always a place related to tragedy, to the migrant tragedy, and so either to death or to somehow the fear of migration, numbers and things. And the people of Lampedusa were somehow always left on a side. So there was, from the beginning, the need to change the point of view and be able to tell the story also from the point of view of the island, which I wanted to show that was not only a container, but was a place with an identity. And for 20 years, Lampedusa embraced people, because more than 400,000 people passed from Lampedusa in all this year. And I remember when the first time, Dr. Bartolo was the first person I met in Lampedusa. I was sick. I had enormous doubt to make this film or not, because I thought how complicated it was. Because as I say, I'm going to a place to tell the story of migration. There's no migrants whatsoever in this island. How I'm going to tell this story? And So I was very doubtful, and I was ready almost to leave with the idea of not coming back there anymore. And I met Dr. Bartolo. I had the bronchitis. I went to the hospital. I met him there, and we talked about everything but my bronchitis. And for 2 hours, he told me the story about Lampedusa and how somehow Lampedusa people, they were so much embracing immigration for more than 20 years. And at a certain point, he told me something very incredible. And I said, why Lampedusa was all, and somehow Lampedusa was also left alone, you know, because nobody really, it was like given for granted that Lampedusa was a place where migrant was passing by, and was really literally left alone, Lampedusa, for all these years, except now it's changing a bit the situation. But you know, there were like, before there were thousands of boats that were like in a cemetery of boats. When they arrived there, these boats, they were abandoned there. And so at a certain point there was this huge land in Lampedusa, was like a cemetery where there were like thousands of boats, of wood boats, that are completely abandoned there, which created this sense of really strong anxiety, talking about anxiety of the kids in Lampedusa, of one of my characters there. And I asked Bartolo what made Lampedusa so welcoming. You know, it's one of the most places where we, you know, it's not a Ferrara. It's been always welcoming migrants there. And he told me, well, we are like a fishermen people, and fishermen always welcome whatever comes from the sea. And this sentence somehow make me really thinking a lot about this generosity about the island. And then that day he gave me a little USB pen, and he told me, now you go home, and you're going to watch this, and I'm sure you're going to come back here. And that what happened. When I watched what was the tragedy that was in this USB pen, it was like his own recollection of encounter, of death, because being the doctor there, he was also making picture of all the tragedy that was somehow passing by Lampedusa. And I really realized in that moment how big of a tragedy this is. And for us, we only used 2 numbers. We are used to hear 250 people died, 3,000 people died, 150,000 came. This is the only numbers, you know. And the numbers, they don't make any more sense right now. So what was important is that to see that in the back of every number there's an eye, there's eyes, and there's an individual. That was somehow what for me was important, the story to tell.
And it's interesting because you're talking about an individual just like your story. Mm-hmm. The title is The Madonna of the Sea. Mm-hmm. Focuses on one story, and through one story you're telling the story of thousands. Yes,
yeah. It's really interesting you're talking about this, the not seeing the Lampedusa is really, you only see the Lampedusans on the island. It was the same way when I was there in 2011. Well, the interesting thing was that year was also the year that a travel magazine, I can't remember which one it was, had named Lampedusa the most beautiful beach in the world. And I can't remember if it was Travel Magazine or Lonely Planet or one of those things where it's pretty big. And it was ironic that this was also the time when there was just, the surge was going to continue, but it was already happening then. I was talking on the island to some of the people who worked in hotels and asking them their perspective of what was happening and the boats coming. And they said something really interesting to me. One woman kept saying, but you have to understand, and this is, maybe I'll throw this back to you. She said, you know, everyone calls them I clandestini, like kind of people who come in illegally, the clandestine. She said, but to us here on the island, they are I recuperati, like they're the recovered, they're the saved. Like we are going out there, and we want to save the people that are coming in, but what can we do when this is also ruining business? You know, it's the tourists aren't coming, they don't want to come anymore. And so I saw that tension when I was there on the island.
In fact, Lampedusa, they don't want the story to be told. You know, they accept the people coming and said, leave us alone. Yeah. They come here, we welcome them here, but don't talk about it. Yeah. Because there is this kind of pudore. How you say like this? Pudore in English. It doesn't. Pudore in English. Pudore.
It doesn't
Nobody knows
exist.
the word pudore. Doesn't exist in English. There is this kind of not willingness of really resilience in a way to talk about migration in Lampedusa, because it's an island that lives of fishermen and tourism, and tourism is one of the biggest resource of the island.
So how did you strike a balance between the desire of the local people to be left alone and to let the story be, and you having a story to tell?
Well, because as I said from the beginning, I wanted to tell the story first of the people, which I did it in the film. The film is the point of view of a little kid and of a doctor. This is some emotionally the film, and then there are little characters that somehow they support the story. And then through their eyes is like the story of the tragedy that arises. But somehow what's happened in the film, which was completely out of my imagination at the beginning, because when I start a project, I never write. I don't like to write a script, because if I write a script, I get stuck on an idea. So I like to discover my film through time and through a long process. That's why I stay 1.5 years in Lampedusa and I live there. So for me, the most important thing was gaining the trust of the people, and then I will tell you a little episode about that. And I'm a one-man crew. I work alone, so I'm not very visible when I'm there. So it's very important for me to create a very strong relationship and a trust with the people that I'm going to start filming and make the film, and become somehow this journey that we all start together, because I never know what I'm filming. Everything is somehow improvising, and the story somehow it develop day by day and months by months, and sometimes years by years in other films, because other film it took me 3-4 years to make a film. In Lampedusa, he's my producer there from Rai Cinema. Was 1.5 years, so somehow was acceptable the timing of when I started till I end the film. And so the main thing for me was trust, and also on the editing was trust. It was a matter of I didn't want to use the people. In my film, I show a tragedy, I show death. So the death of my film somehow is like your character that symbolizes all the other characters. For me, that death symbolized the 25,000 deaths that happened in the Mediterranean Sea. And the film wants to be a cry of help. It's unacceptable. We cannot accept the fact that people die in the sea while living and searching for freedom, living from tragedy, living from desperation, from hunger, from war, from all the devastation that there is there, and people find death in the middle of the sea. And this is the situation that has been perpetrated in years, and Europe never wanted to face this. This is a human slaughter. I think this is one of the biggest tragedies Europe is facing since the World War II, because when we talk about 25,000, again, number they don't make any more sense. It's a huge, immense number of people, and there are kids, and there are women, and there are people that somehow every day they go through an incredible defeat of their own dignity, because what happened in Libya is something close to lagers, is something close to Nazi camp, because these people live for months, years in prison with no water, with no things, where the women are raped, and there are organ market. There's like kids are like sold, women are raped, and then they are forced to live with some other. It's a tragic situation, and if we don't face the problem within there, if we don't have an idea of creating a humanitarian bridge, this is going to be, for me, a defeat of what the European community politics is.
I think also the question becomes with this. This is something that I've been really thinking a lot about, and it was in some ways inspired by a recent New York Times reportage that had photographs of a young, I think he's a young French photographer by the name of Aris Messenis, who's based in Greece. He has somehow, now that you're telling me, people, they have those rescue boats. It doesn't go to the island. Now those photographs make sense. He got onto those boats, and he was taking photographs of the people who the boats full of people who were dead, people who were struggling to get on a boat from the water. There's some very dramatic, very, very powerful images. And I follow him on social media, so I know that he was photographing a lot of different parts of this day where he was on the boat. And yet the New York Times, their editor, their photo editor chose very specific images, and he chose the most grotesque images, the most, I think the most disturbing photos. And initially I said, you know, people have to see this. People have to see how bad this is. And I think this will be a question to you. I think this is something that artists, we have to, this is a question I still don't know the answer to. That we need to be able to show these things, but how do we move the discussion away from masses of people who are dying to actually beginning to talk about human beings, the human beings behind the numbers, like you were saying? How do we get those images that we are seeing to register that we're not talking about just clumps of bodies, but we are actually talking about human beings who have a life outside of this tragedy? I'm thinking of, let's say, my friend Doug Maui. There's this, when I was doing research for this piece, for Granta, and I was watching a lot of videos that Italian news had taken of ships coming in. And quite by accident, I see Doug Maui on one of the video clips. And it just broke my heart, you know, to see him there.
You recognized him?
I recognized him on the boat. And I knew his story, and there he is on this video clip I'm watching. And on the video clip, he's wearing a clean shirt. And I know Doug's story. So I know that he was in one of those Libyan jails for a year and a half, a year. He didn't have shoes. He brought with him from Ethiopia 2 books, 3 books. Dostoevsky was his favorite writer, and his favorite book, another favorite book was Papillon. I forget who it was. Okay, would we even imagine that those people who are on the boats, the migrants, love Dostoevsky or might have brought books with them on those trips? We don't imagine those kinds of lives behind this tragedy. And so Doug, he lost those books. They took it away from him. They took his shoes. He had nothing, yet he had this green shirt, and it was clean and it was new. So I called him and I said, Doug, how did you get this shirt? You were in prison for a year. And he said, all of us tried our best to save, to have one clean shirt. So when we stepped on soil, we would be human beings. He borrowed a shirt from a friend. He didn't even have that. So a friend of his gave him that shirt. And that's where I think, how do we begin to talk about also the tragedy, but the human beings, the lives behind that quest for dignity that I think all of us have. You don't lose it when you step on the boat. You don't lose it when you're in a prison in Libya. In fact, it's that dignity that allows you to stay alive. But how do we begin to address that?
In fact, may I add something to
Yeah.
Of course.
Her question? Do you, in your movie, do you show, do you humanize individual migrants the way perhaps Maza did in her story, choosing one migrant, or there is no reference to one particular story? Or
There's a moment in my film which I think is very important. It's the moment where the Nigerian group are in their room and they pray, and it's a prayer of thanking. And there's a rap, which is between a rap and the gospel. And in these 3 minutes, they tell the story of their journey from Nigeria, escaping from ISIS, the bomb, the desert, Libya, the tragedy in Libya, the need to face the sea and eventually death, and they arrived in Lampedusa. This is an enormous journey, and I think in that 3 minutes, the person that is chanting there is able to give almost a witness of history in that moment. You know, witnessing the tragedy is like an exodus. It's like and I think in that 3 minutes there is really all you can see, all the desperation and the hope that a human being can express. And I think that piece is worth the 1,000 interview or 1,000 questions could have asked and 1,000 answer. So I think I was able to reach that moment of intimacy and that moment of truth and that moment of witnessing, which for me was important, through a very strong emotion. And the rest of the time was very hard to do that because, as I say, in Lampedusa, people arrive very fast. They stay there only 2 days, and then they're brought into the mainland. So my kind of work in my film, I need always time. I need time to build stories. I need time to trust. I would have to spend another year with someone like I did with Samuele in order to be able to be so close. So as a filmmaker, I didn't succeed to be so close to that tragedy. But also, I think that that tragedy is so big that if I would have attempted to do something different, it would be phony. It would be a fake political correctness. It would have been, because sometimes also the tragedy can live in a background, doesn't always have to be on the foreground. So it doesn't mean that if you don't have a close-up of someone, you cannot say that this is the tragedy you want to tell the story. It's not always true that the main tragedy has to be on front, like the Greek chorus teach us that there's a support on the tragedy also from a cause that you never
In fact,
realize it. And
there's
you never
even humor in your movie.
Well, there is moment of humor because life, you cannot, for me, every moment in life you have to have humor, you know, because also when you tell a tragedy, and that's why I like this, the title of my film is related to a song which is extremely light. It's like the most light song you could imagine, and somehow is a song related to a huge tragedy, Fuoco a Mare. And the title is extremely tragic. It's political. It's the most political
Perhaps
things
you would
of
like
my
to
film.
explain the title?
Well, Fuoco a Mare, it's a song related to a tragedy that happened in Lampedusa during the Second World War, and there was a ship, an Italian Navy ship, La Maddalena, which was bombed by a British airplane, and many people died, and there was a huge fire that was illuminating the whole island, and it was a big tragedy of many people died at sea. And there was this song that through the years, the words that were lost, but still the song remained there as a song that tells the story of a tragedy, but with an incredible lightness, which I think it's identify very strongly the identity of the island and of the people, you know, to be able to tell in a light way something very, very tragic. And somehow that's why my point of view in the film is the point of view of a little kid, because and Samuel is a special kid. Samuel is a kid that has an incredible ancient soul, that has an incredible link with the past, that has an incredible, almost an archetype of what we can think about a kid. Now the film is basically a coming of age situation. You know, it's a struggle of a little kid to face life and to face the uncertainty on life, to face the unknown. And when I was filming him, I realized that his interior was somehow supporting the emotion that I have towards the unknown that I was going to film myself, which was the tragedy of which beyond Lampedusa, something that we don't see, but we perceived, you know, and everything that happened in his life, the lazy eye, the anxiety, the things, for me was like a metaphor of what we cannot grab and understand, but you know is coming up towards us. So I chose to give that language. So from a point of view of a little kid in Lampedusa, to be able somehow, and also as a parable, the story, you know, because at the beginning he hunts the bird, and then at the end of the film he talks to a bird. And I think beyond this conversation between this Twitter between him and the bird, there is almost the secret of the film for me, and each of us can put words on this Twitter between Samuele and the little bird, and find probably the most hidden truth about the film itself.
I believe it was The Economist that in a review of your movie, they saw a metaphor in some way as lazy eye as possibly the lazy eye of Europe. Was that intentional, or was that The
I hope
Economist?
that not only the economists see that metaphor, but each person that see the film, because it's something very, very clear. It was not intentional, of course, because that's something that happened in Samuele, but also his lazy eye somehow made a change on him. And so the lazy eye is definitely is a metaphor of our inability to see things, but mostly on how our brain registers things, which does in a different way. And unfortunately, right now, after the film is finished and after all the politics that the European community is, the way the European community is handling this enormous problem, I think lazy eyes will be a wishful thinking. We're talking about total blindness in this moment from Europe. So the film was more positive probably than what the reality came out, in the European policy right now.
Both of you, in writing and in a movie, you describe death. How do you go as far as describing something that dramatic, that graphic, achieving the effect you want and yet not turning off the reader or the viewer?
That's a good question. Well, I think when I was, there are certain sections of my first book that deal very graphically with torture in prisons, interrogations, and dying as a result of that. And I think one of the things that I had to think about as an artist is that I could not tell this as a journalist might, meaning my allegiance was to fiction as much as it was to fact. I know what happens to a human body under the conditions that my characters were living through because I had done the research. But after that, then I had to become the artist and find a way to convey something that none of us really want to think about, which is mortality, and which is, our body in pain and our body subjected to different degrees of pain. We find that uncomfortable. So what is the place of an artist in witnessing this or in creating this so that you, as a reader, as an audience, can begin to witness it so you understand a little bit better the individuals who have to suffer that. And I think I realized that I had to write those sections in a way that the words could deceive you into continuing to read something that you did not want to read, almost as if a doctor might give you a drug and say, this will only hurt a little bit, and then you're okay as you're going through, maybe a dentist getting your teeth pulled. But the words have to do the work, the imagery that's being used, and maybe this is also something that a director has to think about. How much is the eye, the reader, willing to see of something? How far can you push that reader or that audience, the viewer, before they give up and say, that's too much? And I think the artistry is when that comes in, because we have to fool you into following us into those really dark places.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Mazza said. When I started filming in Lampedusa, I encountered that many, many times. Many times in the port of Lampedusa, they were bringing corpses of kids, of women, of men. Many times I saw the doctor having to do all the procedure in order to identify the bodies. Many times I was at sea and I encountered death again. And I always somehow avoided filming death. Maybe I was not prepared. Maybe I didn't know how I would put this in my film. Maybe I didn't want to take the responsibility of having this huge criticism, because it's a fact that you don't show people body death in a situation like that. Adorno always say after the Holocaust you cannot film anymore death. But I encountered death. I didn't want to film death. I encountered death at the border of Europe. I spent more than 40 days on a military navy on the open sea. We made many, hundreds of rescue. One day, 2,000 people were saved on this little rubber boat, and they were coming like hundreds of this rubber boat full and packed of people. In one day, the military people saved more than 2,000 people. And one day, in one of these rescue, which I thought was somehow another rescue in the middle of the sea, I suddenly had this body came towards me, this agonizing body, and I had my camera, and at the beginning I didn't really understand. If you see on the film, I tried to move my camera right and left. There's an helicopter. I tried to go to the people, and I realized that these bodies are coming on my feet. And in that split of the second, I decided, what do? I turn my face, my head somewhere else, and I pretend this didn't happen, or I film this. And that decision was, I filmed that. When I went back to the boat, I didn't know that under the boat that we rescued, there were more and more dead people, like 50 body. They were under the boat, and nobody really knew, because on the top there were probably 500 people, and then another 300 people, and then under another 300 people. And I didn't have this knowledge of that, so I went to the boat and I spent time with try to see how all the procedure was, and then slowly we realized that the more people were coming out, then at the end the commander realized that there were more than 50 people died in that boat, and they died like in a chamber gas, because in this journey, which was only 5-hour journey from Libya, which was 11.5 miles from Libya, these people died basically suffocated with the fume of the engine and no air. So it was literally like a chamber glass. And at a certain point when I filmed the tragedy of the women not able to see anymore their husband, their brother, their companion. And I was there with them. I talked to them. I was the one telling them that unfortunately they were not coming out, more people. And there was a big tragedy that happened. And I was there with them. And then at a certain point I went to the captain of the ship. And he asked me, did you see what happened? And I said, no, I didn't see, but I heard that there were many people died. And he asked me if I filmed that, and I said, no, I didn't want to film that. I cannot go under the boat and film that. And he told me, I think it's your duty to go down there and film this, because the world has to know about this tragedy. This is we are living a tragedy which is so immense that you have somehow to bring this to the world. So I forced myself to go under that boat, and it was something terrible, you know, the heat, the smell, the vision that I had there, and putting my camera and making a frame, adjusting the light, and try to find a way of filming this, which hopefully in a dignified way, which if there's a way of being dignified in front of death, in front of that tragedy. But I did it, and after that, you know, I lost words for days. I couldn't talk anymore, and for me it was the end of my filming. Also the project, I was not able anymore to keep filming and working on this project. And I went back to Lampedusa after 2 weeks, we were still on the boat. And I called immediately my editor, and I say, I think that I cannot film anymore, and we have to start editing with what I have, because I'm not able to keep going on this film. And that's what happened. So when I told him I wanted this 20, 30 seconds of image to be part of the film, then I knew the responsibility was huge, and the film somehow has to be built in order to arrive to this image. So the whole process from the beginning till the moment where we arrived to show that tragedy in the film, the whole film, frame by frame, character by character, situation by situation, was somehow a long journey in order to arrive to that point, and having the audience and the people accepting that as part of the tragedy, and then not only show that, but also be able to live from there, and somehow giving dignity to the death, to that image, and to the people that were part of that, like Dr. Bartolo, the kid, the musician, the thing. So it became a process of involving emotionally all the character. I say character because first they're people, and then they become character when you edit the film, and not betray their trust. So it was an enormous challenge to do that, and I didn't know if we succeed or not. But now, you know, I think the film now is being showed in more than 64 countries around the world. There have been many festivals. I was in Berlin, and I realized that somehow that moment was accepted. You know, it was something that people accept, not as a provocation, not as a voyeurism act, not as a pornographic thing, but as something that people need to know. So it was a big challenge, and it was a big but somehow it was also taking responsibility on that and wanted to do this with all the consequences that could have, because it could have been a total disaster in Berlin. It could have been like, you know, all reaction of people, journalists. But I never read a single article where somehow these things was criticized. So it means that the will that we put on that, it was right. And I believe that this is possible because of two figures in the film. One is the figure of the kids and his interior worlds, and how somehow he accompanies us to this parable. And one is the figure of of Dr. Bartolo. And thanks to his word and who this man is, I think people then are able to accept the tragedy in this film as part of a necessity and not just something gratuitous.
How has telling the story of refugees changed you as a person?
I think the work that I did in Lampedusa was really I think that being on the island and talking to people who lived on the island, the residents of the island, really showed me the tension, the way that this changes everybody involved. I became very sympathetic to those islanders who were struggling just like everyone else to make a living, to survive on the island. And then there is this upheaval that comes into their world, and things will never be the same again. I think at this point Lampedusa has changed even more from the last time I was there. It's become almost a militarized zone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think the fishermen cannot fish anymore. You know, it's their livelihood has changed, and there are friends of mine I know who made that journey and landed in Lampedusa who were saved by some of those residents. So they and periodically they go back to that island to go meet with.
Yeah, the 3rd of October.
Yeah, and and there's that sense, there's a community that has come about as a result of that. And for me, I think before I went there, it was very easy for me to be frustrated by the lack of Italian willingness to do anything, my perceptions of of Europe not doing enough, and Europe is still not doing enough. If we think about I think the percentage of refugees that are in Africa, in different countries, in different refugee camps, that don't make it out of the continent to go into Europe is large. Africa carries the brunt, the large weight of this crisis. And there's a very small percentage that Europe is dealing with right now. It's very easy for me to be frustrated and angry, and I think we all should be. But I also understand that there are people there on the ground who are really working. And I think for me, it was to see that side. I had a really interesting experience when I was there, and I was really quite literally on the shore, just at the shore, on the shore, and the water is right in front of me, just a few feet, and the boats are coming in, and I'm close enough where I can see all of the people on the boats. Very clearly, I can see their facial features, I can see them, they can see me. I'm the only black face in these rows of Italian, Red Cross workers and everyone else. And they look at me and they wave, and so I wave back. And for me, it was this a very emotional moment. And I had a friend with me who is Italian, and she bursts out into tears at that moment. And then I look around and I see some of the residents who have pulled up on their on their mopeds, their bikes, their motorcycles, and they're watching with complete boredom. Boredom mixed with anger, but mostly boredom. And I said at that point, oh my God, for some of them, this is an afternoon outing. This is something this is a way to spend a few hours of an afternoon where you have nothing to do. You watch the boats that are coming in. And I think that the anger, the frustrations that I felt would have been magnified by that moment, if I had not talked to some of the residents. And if I'm still in touch with some of them. I'm still in touch with people who live there, who are actively working to make a difference. And so that is completely, it's changed. It's complicated, as you were saying, Gianfranco.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
It's complicated.
And things change constantly, you know, year by year. Because as I say, you witness something I never witnessed. I never saw a single boat arriving in Lampedusa. And so I never saw any interaction between the islander. When Zia Maria in my film, she's listening on the radio, she hears 250 people die. It's exactly what we do in any house in Europe, in Paris, in Rome, in things. You're just to listen by the radio, oh, someone died. And it's something, it's an echo. That's why somehow in my film, there are many times when it's like this radio exchange, you know, between the military radar and these voices, this echo of desperation in the sea. And I like very much for me it has a lot of meaning, that word when say, what's your position? What's your position? And comes many times in the film. And what's your position is what's our position? What's your position as an individual towards all this? And I always say that if in my film few people come out from the movie asking themselves, what can I do? I don't give answer in my film, but I would like someone that comes out of the film say, what can I do? And many people came after screening to me and say, my need is like, what can I do? So if each of us can ask this question, I think then was worth it making this film.
Questions?
For about half a minute or whatever it lasts, you don't hear sound, you just watch it. And the sound disappears, and so you focus in a completely different level of emotional intensity. But more importantly, it's where it happens in the film. And when you see it as a spectator, at least for me, it suddenly feels that the whole movie up to that point prepared for that. The whole movie, it's implied. Death is implied. You know, this horrible tragedy is going on and it's not shown on screen. And at that particular point, you see just a glimpse. And it's devastating. I mean, I think it's really an incredible cinematic moment. And I think it's a lyrical moment, really.
Yeah, the difficult thing was also not only arriving there, but how you come out from a scene like that. It's funny, in my film, not a single person asked me, let's say my distributor, he knows, the moon that we see is just a moon, it's eclipse. But very, very few people bring out, and that's for me so important. It's a solar eclipse there. So it was a solar eclipse that I witnessed when I was there. You know, it was just a few days after there was this solar eclipse on the military boat, and I was able to film. It happens every, I don't know how many years, every 85 years or something like that, the solar eclipse. So for me it was also important to give dignity to that moment and through silence, because the next I think 50 minutes of the film are completely silent. There's not a single person that talks, so it gives you the time to somehow to go through that mourning and to go through that absorbing of the tragedy. And that was very difficult to do on the editing, because I say my film is not a feature film, so everything was built and emotionally. The structure on the editing was completely emotional of the film. And you know, every scene that I shot is completely real, it's not scripted. So to rebuild on the editing that kind of itinerary was extremely challenging and difficult. And I'm very lucky that I work with an editor since the beginning of my career, from Boatman to this. I always work with the same editor. Sometimes I want to kill him, Jacopo. But I cannot work with anyone else, because at that point you cannot even talk about certain things. Either you understand and you trust each other, and you're able to make things happen. But if you start to analyze too much, if you start to talk too much, if you start to make too many mental things, it doesn't work anymore, you know. So the whole film somehow was built really with, I think with Jacob we share maybe 25 words in all these months of editing, you know. We never talked. It was always a little it was like mumbling, but we never went down and analyzed, you know. Someone came to the editing once. It was like an assistant that she came for 2-3 weeks, and she was completely surprised that she said, "But you never talk about the film." No, we never did talk about the film. It was just emotion. Was just like really, was not theorizing things. Was not about analyzing things. Was just really be able to grab the right guts, the right inner word, and that's somehow what is very important also, you know. Sorry.
A question for you, Gianfranco Rosi. You mentioned that your participation to the Berlin Festival. Berlin.
Berlin.
Germany. Yeah. Because your movie is very important not only for what it shows, but also for how the audience reacts. So I'm curious, as Germany has underwent a dramatic change in its attitude. Just 1 year ago, they had a very open policy, at least the government, Angela Merkel. Now it's very, very different. So I would like to know if you could share with us some of the reactions you got from the German audience in Berlin.
Yeah, it's very important to say that when we start this film, and Paolo is a witness of this, nobody really talked about migration. There was no, besides in Italy maybe, you know, but Europe was not an issue at all. Nobody really talked about migration. It was something that belonged to Greece, it belonged to Turkey, belonged to Italy, belonged to So when I started this film, was really the necessity of like showing to the people what was Lampedusa, what was, you remember when we were talking also, this Mayor Nicolini came there that day, and there was a need somehow to show that there was a place somewhere in Europe that things were happening. And Europe was completely not talking. Through the years, when I started almost finishing the film, because I remember when I filmed that tragedy, it was the 15th of August. And that was the time when Europe started talking, because the so it was May, June, July, they start really talking about it. It became this obsession. Finally, Europe realized that millions of people are moving. There are people moving in this world. Oops, they're invading us. Oh, panic, panic, panic. So it was August, September, October, November, December. People just talked about that. You remember, it was like an increasing talk, and suddenly the world realized that there are people moving in this world. And when I arrived in Berlin, the film became immediately extremely political film. If this film would have come out 2-3 years ago, it would be just a film in a strange island in the sea where strange people arrive, and there's a strange kid killing birds, and would it be just a come-of-age film, you know, which had been taken as a microcosm of something very strange that we don't understand. Suddenly, this film became upfront statement of politics, and I think the film is political, but it's political beyond. And I always say in the film there are 3 stories. There is a story of the island, there is a story of the migrants, and then outside the frame there is politics. And politics in this film is really, really pushing so much. And that happened definitely in Berlin. And sometimes I'm scared, you know, because I feel that somehow this film can become like a way of cleansing the conscience, the consciousness, no, and it's a bit frightening this, because you know, the film was shown in in Berlin at the Parliament. It was shown at the United Nations. It was shown at in Brussels. It was shown at the European Parliament. Every politician came to see the film, but and it became really the outside, the politics outside the frame is pumping so much, and in that moment in Germany they were ready really, because the film also got this enormous audience award. So there was really a film that was loved by the audience there. But Berlin is definitely a particular city. And then slowly also Germany started changing, like France is changing, like maybe Italy is changing now with all these things and this is something that scares me enormously. You know, when we have country like Austria, like Hungary, like now Germany, like Poland, making their own policy in something that should become like a European politics, and each country makes its own decision. You know, the problem of the quotas is an incredible problem. Schengen is an incredible problem, and Europe is not able to face that. So if every single country is left on its own political decision towards migration, it's completely defeat of what's going to happen to Europe. I think I'm very, very not optimistic for the future of all this when you see single country taking positions that are not anymore shared by the European community, like, you know, the referendum that was made in Hungary. Like, I think last year in Hungary they only accept four migrants this year. 4. Which is like a joke, you know. It's like, and then I mean, for me, it was very strong the Barack Obama speech that he made at the United Nations, that, you know, somehow America is willing to accept more than 350,000 people, and what he said incredibly for me, which was extremely strong. He said, if you build a wall, you build a prison for yourself. And this is what Europe has to understand, you know, that the wall never resist history. And that's why somehow Berlin was so open towards this and the film, because they realized that wall, sooner or later they fall down. There's no wall that resisted history. But now what scares me mostly is the mental wall of the people, you know. The mental wall are even more scary than the physical wall.
What you're both saying is not just the story of the migrants of the land and of politics, but it's also a story about the Mediterranean. And so, if I see these stories from the point of view of the Mediterranean, and we think the big history of the Mediterranean, which was transformed during the 20th century into the sea of naked bodies because of tourism, because all beaches were filled with naked bodies. We are now seeing a transformation of this landscape into the sea, as you said, the sea of death somehow. And so there is a different level of tension between tourist industry and migration, which involves geography and the politics, the geopolitics of geography and the Mediterranean. I was planning to show your film in my class, history class, about Italy in the Mediterranean. And I'm now realizing, here you talking, that actually Italy considered somehow Lampedusa to be outside the geography of Italy. It was something, you know.
For years it was like that. Now a bit less.
Now a
but
bit less.
In the past it was
but
like that.
I have the impression somehow that a country.
In Lampedusa, they don't consider themselves not even Sicilian.
Exactly. So
they hate
I have the impression that the land, the countries like Italy and Greece and even Spain, they
You're from Greece, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
They wanted so much to be connected to the Mediterranean of the naked bodies, the tourist Mediterranean. But they don't want geographically.
Well,
that is
Lesbo,
not so much connection to the death Mediterranean.
Lesbo is exactly the story of Lesbo, is the story of Lampedusa.
But
and also
I'm
Lesbo
saying,
was left alone for a long time.
I'm saying that they do not imagine themselves geographically, the country, yet as part of the Mediterranean of death. This is what I'm trying to say, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. So you're not going to show the film anymore to your class? Yeah.
More questions? I meant to ask you, Meryl Streep said that, Meryl Streep said that this is urgent, imaginative, and necessary filmmaking. How important is to have the strong voice or the strong backing of a name like Meryl Streep in order to advance towards Oscar night, and not for a personal level, but because the movie, because I think from the reaction of the audience, we can tell this is an urgent movie to show. We want to win, not just for you, but for the refugees.
Yeah, nobody knows how hard is this journey for the Oscar. People think, it's nightmare. I have my distributor here. It's really a nightmare. Nothing is a warranty on that. It's going to be a very, very long journey, and who knows what's going to be. Even to arrive on the shortlist is an enormous challenge. So then from the shortlist,
just to update the audience, it's the Italian entry to the Oscars, and there's 85, I believe, foreign movies, and the choice will be announced, I believe, on January 20.
Yeah, first you have to enter on the 9, and then from the 9 on the 5, and then whatever.
In December it will be down to
first,
9,
yeah,
and then 5.
Yeah, but that's a lot of work to arrive to the 9.
Have any of you already seen the movie, which opened on Friday?
Yeah. Okay. So more have
More.
to go. More. But now, what you were asking about Meryl Streep, and then we close this, and then hopefully also you can make a conclusion on your.
Yes.
For me, to be in Berlin, in the competition in Berlin with a big film, with the documentary, was already an incredible victory. To break the barrier between documentary and fiction for the second time, because first it happened in Venice and then in Berlin. And you never think about the award. When you're there, there's no way you think about the award. And also, my film was the first film that was screened. And the idea of having, there were three actors as juror in my film. So I was like very sad, well, they will never consider my film, as a film for an important award, because my film has nothing to do with what main feature film stream is. And I said, plus was the beginning of the film, so I said they will forget completely my film at the end of the festival. So I completely gave up the idea of getting any award there. But then when I got the award, Meryl Streep told me that the film was a golden bear from the first day till the last. So it was very strong, beautiful words that she gave me. And she immediately told me that day, she whispered in my ear, I will support your film for the Oscar, and I'm sure the film can arrive, at least try to arrive there. So it's really an enormous emotion to have her backing on the film.
Maza, are you done telling the story of refugees?
No, I'm not. I'm not. I think one of the things that powerful scene that you were talking about in your film reminded me again that there are still things that we have to do. As much as we are now becoming aware, more aware, thanks to films like this one, about the crossings and the people who are trying to get across. One of the things that I think as a world we are going to have to deal with is the fact that thousands of those people who do not make it, who drown at sea, end up being buried in mass graves because there's no one to identify them. The general law is that wherever the bodies wash up, the country has to deal with that. Wherever they happen to be, then that country has to deal with it. So what's happening in Greece and what's happening in Italy, Morocco, all these kind of border countries, is that there's just nobody really wants to deal with the task of identifying the victims, and so they're buried in unmarked graves There are numbers put on those graves, kind of just marked on a marker on a stone.
Also because most of them, unfortunately,
And they
they
don't
have no
have
passport,
ID.
they don't have ID, so it's really incredible.
But
Dr. Bartolo,
scientists
Dr. Bartolo,
Yeah.
he say he does always the autopsy
Yes.
in order to get the DNA, and
yeah,
he
yeah.
catalogs all the DNA he has, because if any time
Yeah.
anyone could
And
for
he-
identification, his
in that
incredible task that he's doing there.
In that film, he was really a hero to me. He's doing something that not many scientists want to do,
Yeah.
or if they want to do it, they don't have the money, they don't have the funding to do it. And this is something that can be funded, and it's not being done. So I think that this conversation we're having, as much as we are realizing people are coming and stepping onto the land in Europe, we also have to begin the conversation of what happens. How are we responsible for those people who don't make it? Who is our responsibility? How accountable are we for those people who no one claims? And I think we saw this in World War II, and it's one of the things that struck me with the writings of Primo Levi, that he was trying valiantly and consistently up to the last day of his life to make sure that everyone that he could was accounted for in his writings. Those people who were just numbers that became unnamed and were buried, he resurrected them through his writing, through art. And I think that's the next frontier, I think, for us as artists, as directors, writers.
Yeah, and also to know what happened to these people
Yeah.
after they arrived in Lampedusa, after they arrived in Italy, most of the people arrive in Italy, they don't want to stay in Italy. They have relatives, parents, things all over Europe. And the fact that the law doesn't allow you to move from the place where we arrived, that's something that somehow it's a big defeat, also of our democracy and of our losing the respect of what the individual wants to, where to go. And so the fact that Europe said, no, they arrive in Italy, they have to stay in Italy. And again, the quote system is not accepted in the rest of Europe because it's so bureaucratic things. As I said, a country like Hungary got only 4 people. In Italy this year we got like more than 130,000 people from January 1st up to now. And the fact that Schengen doesn't exist for migrants. Also for people that, another thing for me that is absurd, it's people that arrive and they're working, let's say in France, in Italy and things. Then once they're there, they have a permit, a working permit that doesn't allow them to go back to their country, come back to Italy. So once they're in Italy or in France or wherever they are, they cannot even go back to see their relatives or parents in Africa. I remember when I was in New York, I was studying, sometimes struggling, so New York was, became so expensive to live that I had to go back somewhere else. And then always with the idea of coming back to New York, for me it was very important to be able to come back here. So imagine there are people that are saving maybe 10,000 euro. And with the 10,000 euro, they could go back to their country and live maybe for 8 months, for 80 years or 6 months, and then go back in Italy again and work. And this will create already an exchange. And these people are forced to be in Italy. Maybe they don't have work, they don't have any more money, and they end up in the street, And this is another tragedy, that not allowing people to move and to go back and forth and to be able to come from Africa and back to Italy or from Sweden. So if we create an exchange, like Schengen, I think this will be like definitely politics that will help a lot to create an evolution on that, And also another word that scares me a lot is the word integration, It's a scary word, that because integration suppose you don't move and people have to come towards you. I remember when I lived in New York, there was never this word like integration. Each one maintain his own identity, and each one give up some of his own identity and make a move, and find it somehow a ground which is a common ground.
Let's end with a quick, beautiful image. The Madonna of the Sea, the title of your piece. Why this particular? Who is the Madonna of the Sea?
There is a statue off the coast of Lampedusa that's under the water, and it's an absolutely beautiful statue. And the Madonna it's the Madonna. It's Mary, and she's holding a Christ figure, I believe. Now I've seen so many images of this. But if you go on YouTube and you Google Madonna of the Sea, you will see this. And she is there as a patron saint of the sea for the Lampedusans. And she welcomes all those who don't make it onto land. But she also helps guide ships back to land. So I use that image in the writing because it was absolutely beautiful that no matter what, those people on the sea are not alone, regardless, and that there is a force force of hope that is sending them to the land.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.